Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm delighted to have you join me for another captivating tale. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you relaxing at home, on the go, or somewhere a bit unexpected? Share your answer in the comments. I always enjoy hearing from our wonderful community. Now let's get cozy and dive into tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Circle Gathers. The village hall was wrapped in a soft, golden glow, the kind of light that made the frost outside seem almost magical. Miss Marple stepped inside, her shawl brushing lightly against her coat, and took a slow, appreciative breath. The scent of pine from the modest Christmas tree by the corner mingled with the faint, inviting aroma of fresh-baked pastries. There was something undeniably comforting about this small hall, worn wooden floors and all, yet tonight it seemed to hum with the quiet anticipation of the annual knitting circle Christmas gathering. She smiled to herself, enjoying the simple pleasure of these familiar surroundings, yet her keen eyes already began to notice the subtle movements and expressions of those present. She began by arranging the chairs in their usual semicircle, careful to leave just enough space for people to move comfortably, her hands steady but attentive to detail. As she placed the last chair, a gentle warmth from the nearby fireplace reached her cheeks, carrying with it the faint, sweet tang of burning wood. The rustle of wool and knitting needles echoed softly from a corner table, where Mrs. Withers had already started to sort through her collection of yarns, muttering about the difficulty of choosing the right shade for a festive scarf. Mrs. Withers, ever the gossip, looked up and gave Miss Marple a sharp, cheerful nod, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of curiosity and mischief. "Ah, Miss Marple, I do hope you're ready for our little celebration. I hear you've been exceptionally busy this year," Mrs. Withers said, her voice carrying just enough lightness to hint at her penchant for subtle probing. Miss Marple returned a smile, noting the slight tension in the way Mrs. Withers kept glancing toward the table where the assortment of pies had been arranged. Indeed, the pies were the first real source of today's small, unspoken rivalry. The scent of mincemeat, apple, and a hint of cinnamon drifted through the hall, enticing and warm. Yet behind the delicious aromas was the invisible undercurrent of village competition. Who had baked the best pie this year? As Miss Marple laid out plates and napkins, a young woman lingered by the doorway, her hands clasped nervously. The newcomer to the circle, fresh to village life, seemed caught between anticipation and trepidation, uncertain of where to place herself among the familiar faces. Miss Marple approached her gently. "Welcome, my dear. Do you knit often?" she asked, her voice soft, inviting trust. The young woman nodded quickly, cheeks tinged with pink, grateful for the kindness and unassuming attention. Miss Marple's eyes, however, noted the flicker of apprehension as she glanced at Mrs. Withers, who was already commenting on the newcomer's choice of scarf colour, suggesting rather pointedly that she might benefit from a little more experience in the craft. Small remarks delivered with the faintest edge, but enough to plant the tiniest seed of tension. The club president, confident and poised, swept across the hall, offering nods and cheerful greetings. Her presence brought a sense of order to the room, yet even she could not entirely mask the subtle discord simmering beneath the surface. The room, while cosy and bright, carried whispers of competition and the delicate balancing act of polite conversation. Miss Marple moved from table to table, exchanging a word here, a smile there, observing who lingered a little too long over particular pieces of pie, who adjusted their scarves with a certain deliberate care, and who seemed reluctant to meet another's eye. Each gesture, small as it might seem, added to the intricate tapestry of the gathering. By the time the chairs were properly aligned, the table laden with treats and greetings exchanged in careful measure, the hall felt alive with gentle excitement and subtle curiosity. The pine scent, the crackle of the fire, and the soft rhythm of knitting needles provided a comforting backdrop. Yet beneath it all, Miss Marple sensed the first faint hints of the evening's underlying tension. It was there, in the quiet moments, in the almost imperceptible shifts of glances and hesitations, that she began to wonder which threads of conversation might eventually unravel, and which small disagreements might lead to a story worth unraveling. In this gentle Christmas warmth, the stage was quietly set for secrets to emerge. The room settled into a gentle rhythm as knitting needles clicked softly against one another, a soothing counterpoint to the occasional rustle of wool. Miss Marple, seated near the middle of the semicircle, allowed her eyes to wander, taking in the familiar scene with her habitual quiet attention. The warm glow of the fireplace painted flickering patterns on the walls, and the scent of cinnamon and pine mingled with the faint aroma of tea from cups carefully placed on saucers. Everything seemed, at first glance, entirely ordinary, a perfect, cosy gathering. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and tonight subtle shifts in posture and glance drew her curiosity like magnets. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Withers, who, in the midst of narrating a story about a particularly troublesome scarf, kept glancing furtively toward the corner of the table where a small folded note lay. The paper was simple, unremarkable, yet its presence seemed to weigh on Mrs. Withers with a tension she could not fully disguise. Every few moments her eyes darted toward it, her hands tightening around her knitting needles as though the yarn might provide some small comfort against the unease the note inspired. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her own yarn as she observed, noting the quiet ripple of apprehension passing through the older woman's demeanour. Something, she thought, was hidden behind that glance, something worth noticing. Even at this early stage of the evening, nearby, the newcomer fidgeted with a half-finished scarf, quickly pulling it under her lap whenever the club president passed by. Her movements were small, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested anxiety beyond what one might expect from mere nerves of meeting a new group. Miss Marple's eyes met the young woman's for a brief moment, and she caught the flash of embarrassment, or was it secrecy? It was difficult to tell, and that alone made it interesting. The innocent appearance of the scarf hid an unsettled energy, a small indication that not all threads in this knitting circle were as neat as they seemed. Even in a room filled with warmth and laughter, some emotions clung quietly beneath the surface, tugging at subtle corners of attention. As needles moved, voices lowered. A few whispered questions began to circulate, soft and tentative. One villager asked another about a minor disagreement from the previous year, and another muttered about a rumour that had been circulating quietly through the village. Each whisper, though polite in tone, carried undercurrents of curiosity and suspicion. Miss Marple, experienced in reading such social cues, could trace the invisible lines of connection and tension weaving between her friends. Here was a disagreement left unresolved, there a rumour half believed but eagerly repeated. The layers of village life, normally comforting in their familiarity, seemed to shift under the weight of these minor disturbances. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, piecing together the fragments she observed. The furtive glances, the hidden scarf, the whispered questions. They were small, almost negligible, yet collectively they suggested a pattern. Some trust had been mislaid, some grievance left to fester. The warmth of the room, the bright decorations, the gentle hum of conversation, all these cosy details formed a backdrop against which a subtle tension now appeared more distinct. It was a tension that did not shout, but whispered, and for Miss Marple that was far more compelling. Something hidden, something unsettled, was stirring among her friends, and the thought drew a faint smile across her face. The story, she realized, was beginning to write itself stitch by stitch, beneath the cheerful exterior of the Christmas knitting circle. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere retained its festive charm, yet the faintest shadows of doubt had begun to settle over the group. Miss Marple continued to observe, silently noting who relaxed and who stiffened, who lingered over tea, and who seemed determined to avoid certain conversations. By the time the first rounds of hot cocoa were served, She had already begun forming a delicate map of secrets, hints, and minor transgressions, each one a thread leading toward a scandal quietly waiting to surface. The knitting circle, she mused, might appear serene, yet beneath the comfort and laughter something quietly intriguing was unfolding, promising curiosity for those who knew how to look. Chapter 2. Secrets Among the Stitches. The knitting circle settled into a gentle rhythm once more, the soft murmur of conversation and the steady click of needles blending with the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward in her chair, her hands resting lightly on her knitting, observing with that quiet attentiveness which had long made her the village's subtle chronicler of human behaviour. Around her, familiar faces shared pleasantries, but the air carried the faintest undertone of tension, like a thread woven so thinly it could almost be overlooked. Yet she noticed it, the slight stiffening of shoulders, the fleeting glances exchanged between friends, the tiny smiles that did not quite reach certain eyes. Mrs. Withers, never one to resist the allure of attention, leaned closer to her neighbours and began to speak in a tone that was meant to be conversational, yet carried the delicious undertone of secretive excitement. Years ago there was an heirloom, an exquisite silver brooch, delicate and old as the village itself. It vanished one Christmas Eve, and though it was never spoken of openly, whispers have lingered ever since. She paused deliberately, letting the words settle into the soft hum of the room. A few of the knitters drew in breath, their eyes widening in mild surprise, while others exchanged subtle, knowing looks. It was the kind of story that was both harmless and compelling, a spark beneath the gentle flame of holiday cheer. Miss Marple's eyes followed the subtle currents of reaction. Some villagers nodded politely, their faces composed, yet their glances flickered toward one another, betraying curiosity, or perhaps unease. One young woman, seated close to the fireplace, shifted in her chair and bit her lip, as though the mention of the lost heirloom awakened a memory she was hesitant to reveal. Another, a matronly figure with spectacles perched delicately on her nose, pursed her lips and glanced almost surreptitiously at Mrs. Withers, a silent signal of mild disapproval or caution. Each glance, each tiny movement, became a story in itself, and Miss Marple absorbed them quietly, like stitches forming an intricate pattern. The room, despite these subtle ripples of curiosity, retained its cosy charm. Pine-scented air, twinkling fairy lights, and the faint warmth of the fire created a comforting backdrop for the unfolding social dance. Yet within this warmth, an undercurrent of unease whispered softly, almost imperceptibly, teasing the mind with questions unspoken. Who remembered the heirloom clearly? Who had a reason to be concerned about its disappearance? And who, amidst the seemingly festive tranquility, might be guarding a secret that could disrupt the evening entirely? Soft laughter rippled through the circle, a polite and gentle sound, yet each laugh was punctuated by careful observation. Miss Marple noted who participated with ease and who lingered near the edges. Observing rather than engaging, Mrs. Withers continued, her voice lowering slightly. They say it was passed from hand to hand in the family, treasured more than words could convey, until one Christmas it simply vanished. Some claim it was mislaid, others whisper that perhaps it was taken. Her eyes twinkled faintly, aware of the effect her tale had produced. Even in the warm light, shadows of doubt flickered across certain faces, though outwardly no one betrayed panic or alarm. Miss Marple's mind quietly catalogued the information, weaving connections from gestures, whispered remarks, and fleeting expressions. The heirloom, she sensed, was more than just a story. It was a subtle probe, a test of reactions, a way to glimpse which of her neighbours might hold fragments of past mysteries or lingering regrets. The room's cosy holiday ambiance softened the tension, creating a gentle contrast that made each revelation feel simultaneously intimate and suspenseful. Listeners, enveloped in the warmth of the scene, were invited to notice, to wonder, and to imagine the web of relationships that lay quietly beneath every smile, every glance, and every carefully chosen word. By the time Mrs. Withers finished recounting her tale, the knitting circle seemed alive with quiet contemplation. The story of the lost heirloom had settled into minds like a subtle perfume, pleasant, intriguing, and impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, with her serene composure, smiled inwardly. Beneath the comfort of yarn and firelight, the first true threads of a hidden story were beginning to appear, inviting attention, curiosity, and the gentle unraveling of secrets that only the observant could perceive. The gentle rhythm of the knitting circle was interrupted by a soft, hesitant knock at the village hall door. Heads turned, and Miss Marple, ever alert to even the smallest disruptions, paused mid-stitch. The hall, warm with the glow of the fireplace and scented with pine and baking spices, seemed suddenly charged with quiet anticipation. A tall figure stood in the doorway, coat dusted lightly with snow, eyes scanning the room with an unusual intensity. It was clear at once that this was no ordinary visitor, no neighbour stopping by to exchange pleasantries. The tone in which they spoke carried urgency, almost an edge, that immediately drew every glance in their direction. "I apologize for the intrusion," the visitor said, voice steady but serious, "but I bring news concerning the knitting circle." "It cannot wait." The words, though calm, created an almost imperceptible ripple through the cosy gathering. Mrs. Withers clutched her knitting needles a little tighter, the newcomer's presence slicing through the warmth like a gentle wind, carrying hints of unease. Miss Marple, serene yet attentive, leaned forward slightly, her mind already dissecting the figure's posture, the cadence of their speech, and the subtle tension in their hands. There was something measured in their approach, something deliberate, as if every word had been chosen with care to convey both importance and discretion. The club president rose politely, offering a courteous nod. "Do come in, sir, or madam. We were just settling into our evening." The visitor's eyes flicked toward the circle, taking in the faces with rapid precision, lingering slightly on each person as though assessing reactions, measuring unspoken responses. Their gaze carried weight, though it was tempered with civility, and Miss Marple could not help noticing the slight inconsistencies, a hesitation before words were spoken, the subtle shift of one foot, as if balancing unease with purpose. It was the kind of observation only a trained eye or a long-practiced observer of human nature could detect. "I understand this may seem sudden," the visitor continued, "but certain matters relating to this circle must be addressed. There are details that will come to light very soon, and it is best you are prepared." Their words lingered, resonating quietly with a sense of forewarning. Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of their jaw, the careful pause before each statement, and the way the fingers of one hand flexed against the coat pocket, revealing small signs of tension that contradicted the otherwise composed exterior. Each gesture, minute as it was, hinted at something withheld, something important enough to warrant this abrupt intrusion on a festive evening. Before anyone could inquire further, the visitor gave a small, enigmatic smile, almost apologetic, and added, "At Christmas, many things tend to be revealed, some to surprise, others to unsettle. Consider this a gentle prelude." And just as quietly as they had arrived, the figure stepped back toward the door, offering a polite bow, and vanished into the snowy night. The hall seemed to exhale collectively, the warmth of the fire once again brushing against chilled nerves, though the visitor's words lingered, curling softly around the edges of everyone's thoughts. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting still resting in her lap, but her mind was quietly alert. She considered the visitor's tone, their posture, the slight incongruity she had noted. Something was afoot, she realized, something that required patience, careful observation, and the gentle unraveling of subtle clues. The circle's chatter resumed, though now more subdued, each whisper carrying the faint echo of the visitor's warning. Even amidst the glow of the hall, the scent of pine and baked pies, the soft click of needles, an invisible thread of curiosity and suspense had been drawn taut, inviting attention, speculation, and the quiet unraveling of a story yet to fully emerge. Listeners, settled in their comfortable chairs or tucked beneath blankets, could feel the gentle tension, the delicate intrigue. The visitor had arrived and departed, but the questions remained. Who had sent them? What was the news? And, most intriguingly, which secrets would truly be revealed as Christmas approached? Miss Marple's serene expression offered no answers, only the promise of careful discovery, as the knitting circle prepared to continue under the cosy, flickering glow of the hall and the quiet anticipation of what was yet to come. Chapter 3. Tangled Threads. Miss Marple lingered near the far corner of the village hall, her fingers brushing lightly over the polished surface of a small side table. Something had drawn her attention there, an old wooden box tucked beneath a stack of folded tablecloths, partially hidden as though forgotten over the years. With careful hands, she lifted the lid, revealing a collection of letters, some yellowed with age, others slightly crumpled at the edges. The familiar scent of aged paper mingled with the lingering aroma of pine and the faint sweetness of pastries from the evening's gathering, creating a curious mixture of comfort and unease. She set the box on her lap, her eyes scanning the neatly tied bundles and envelopes with an instinct honed by years of quiet observation. The first letter was addressed to the knitting circle president from decades earlier, its formal handwriting betraying a tone of restrained frustration. It spoke of disagreements over the organization of events, complaints about missing supplies, and subtle accusations that certain members had been less cooperative than they ought to have been. Miss Marple traced the elegant loops of ink with her eyes, noting the careful phrasing and the underlying tension threaded through polite language. Even within such courteous words, the scent of past resentments lingered, like the faint echo of an argument remembered long after it was spoken. She folded it back gently, as if handling it too roughly might disturb the hidden meanings within. Another letter, smaller and slightly torn, revealed a more personal grievance. A villager wrote of a mislaid gift, a misunderstanding over a donation, and the quiet hurt that had grown from what seemed trivial to outsiders. Yet in Miss Marple's experienced mind, trivialities often became the seeds of future complications. She read carefully, noting the phrasing, the pauses suggested by ellipses, the way one thought ran into another. Each detail hinted at subtle betrayals or small slights that might otherwise have been forgotten, but could, over time, develop into something more significant. The warmth of the hall contrasted sharply with the tension curling through these words, a delicate balance that Miss Marple appreciated fully as she continued through the stack. Another envelope caught her attention, sealed with a small wax emblem long faded. Inside, the letter spoke of alliances and rivalries within the circle, subtle power struggles over who directed activities, who received the most attention, who was quietly excluded from social opportunities. It was all so polite in writing, so gentle in tone, yet the undertones were unmistakable. Miss Marple could almost see the shadow of these old disagreements stretching quietly into the present, like invisible threads connecting past and current tensions. She realized that tonight's gathering, seemingly cheerful and festive, was layered atop years of delicate, unresolved history. Her fingers lingered on the final letter. Addressed in a hurried, almost impatient hand, the words spoke of a long-standing quarrel that had cooled only superficially, a disagreement about trust, promises left unkept, and a lingering suspicion that someone in the circle had acted selfishly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she pieced together connections between these letters, matching names, events, and sentiments. The documents formed a mosaic of village life, small grievances intertwined with affection, playful rivalry balanced with genuine care. Yet within the warmth and familiarity lay the potential for conflict, subtle yet ready to resurface if the right moment arrived. For a long moment, Miss Marple simply held the letters, absorbing their quiet significance. The hall hummed softly around her, the knitting needles, the crackling fire, the hum of conversation, but her attention remained fixed on these fragments of history. Each envelope and note revealed hints of motive, whispers of past transgressions, and the potential for tensions to unravel further. In the cosy winter light, amid the scent of pine and tea, she felt a quiet thrill at the discovery. Beneath the calm and festive surface of the evening, the threads of old grievances had begun to stir, promising to weave a story that demanded careful attention and gentle unraveling. As the evening settled deeper into a calm rhythm, the villagers gathered in small clusters, knitting needles moving in unison while voices dropped to quiet murmurs. The warmth of the fire and the soft glow of fairy lights gave the hall a serene, intimate atmosphere, yet beneath the gentle chatter, subtle confessions began to surface, one delicate revelation at a time. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual chair, fingers resting lightly on her own knitting, listening with careful attention. She did not press for information overtly, but her presence seemed to encourage honesty in those who were inclined to speak softly to trusted neighbors. A middle-aged woman, who usually contributed little to the circle's discussions, lowered her voice and admitted to a minor oversight from a previous year, an event that, while trivial on the surface, had caused a ripple of unease among a few members. Her confession was framed as apology and self-deprecation, yet Miss Marple detected the flicker of relief as she spoke, as if admitting her lapse allowed a small burden to lift from her shoulders. Nearby, another villager quietly revealed that she had once overheard a conversation about the missing heirloom, adding a tiny, tantalizing detail about a person who might have been involved. The subtlety of the information intrigued Miss Marple, who made a mental note of every name, every hesitation, every soft glance that followed the revelations. Even the newcomer, who had arrived only a few evenings prior, felt emboldened to speak. She admitted to misplacing a pattern, a small error that had caused minor confusion in a past gathering, and spoke with a blush that made her words seem both earnest and tentative. Miss Marple smiled inwardly, recognizing the courage it took to admit such things in front of a group of village elders and familiar faces. Each tiny confession, while seemingly inconsequential, formed threads that intertwined with others, subtle hints of trust, slight grievances, and unspoken alliances beginning to emerge. The knitting circle, with its gentle clatter of needles and occasional laughter, had become a quiet theatre for personal truths. Miss Marple, as always, listened not only to the words themselves but to the pauses, the glances and the inflections that accompanied them. A slight stiffening of a shoulder, a fleeting avoidance of eye contact, a breath drawn too quickly, all became clues in the intricate tapestry of human behavior. She guided conversations gently, asking questions that seemed casual yet prompted disclosure. "Do you remember the last winter meeting?" she would inquire softly. Or, "I think someone once mentioned an old scarf that went missing. What became of that?" These small nudges encouraged people to speak without realizing the subtle trail of information they were leaving behind. To any casual observer, the circle remained simply a festive, cozy gathering. But Miss Marple's attentive mind pieced together fragments of a larger, hidden picture. By the time a second cup of tea was poured, the knitting circle had transformed from a social meeting into a subtle exchange of truths. Confessions, slight and personal, had revealed patterns of behavior, minor regrets, and fleeting alliances. Miss Marple noted who seemed relieved after sharing, who tensed when listening, and who avoided acknowledging certain details. The cozy hall, with its pine scent, soft lighting, and flickering fire, provided the perfect backdrop, intimate enough for secrets to surface, safe enough for listeners to feel a part of the scene without intrusion. Throughout it all, the atmosphere remained warm and festive, yet the soft revelations introduced a quiet tension. Each shared memory, each minor confession hinted at connections between characters that had lain hidden beneath the surface. Miss Marple's mind catalogued every subtle nuance, weaving the pieces together like stitches in a complex pattern. Listeners, safe in the comfort of the hall's imagery, experienced the thrill of eavesdropping on truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. Their curiosity deepened, eager to discover how these private disclosures would contribute to the story that was slowly unfolding beneath the glow of holiday cheer. Chapter 4. A Knitting Mishap. The steady rhythm of the knitting circle was broken by a sudden clatter. A cup of steaming tea had tipped over, spilling its contents across the edge of the table, drenching a tangle of yarn that had been neatly coiled just moments before. Gasps filled the hall, knitting needles paused mid-motion, and a few startled hands fluttered in reflexive attempts to rescue the scattered supplies. The warm glow of the fireplace and the scent of pine offered a comforting contrast to the small chaos unfolding on the floor. Yet the energy of the room had shifted instantly from calm to tense curiosity. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting poised but undisturbed, observed the scene with quiet attentiveness. A few villagers leaned quickly to mop up the spill, their murmured apologies blending with polite laughter that tried, unsuccessfully, to mask mild panic. Mrs. Withers, whose excitement often bordered on theatrical, fluttered about with exaggerated dismay, muttering about how clumsy hands and careless placement could ruin even the most harmonious gathering. Miss Marple's eyes, however, focused not on the tea itself but on what the accident had inadvertently revealed. Beneath the now soaked yarn lay a small stack of envelopes, partially hidden and seemingly forgotten until the cup had made them impossible to ignore. The sudden exposure of the letters drew subtle reactions from the knitters. A few faces paled slightly while others exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the intrusion into what had previously been private matters. Even the newcomer fidgeted, casting a nervous glance toward the envelopes as if wondering what secrets they might hold. Miss Marple's calm composure offered a reassuring presence, though her sharp mind catalogued every response, noting who reached immediately to cover the letters, who lingered with curiosity, and who attempted to divert attention with casual conversation. Each reaction provided a clue, a small piece of the puzzle quietly unraveling in the center of the cozy hall. The spill also disrupted the pattern of the circle itself. Skeins of yarn twisted together, forming knots that demanded attention, and several partially finished scarves were momentarily abandoned in the scramble to recover both tea and letters. Miss Marple watched as alliances and rivalries subtly revealed themselves through gestures. One villager offered to help untangle a particularly stubborn knot, while another insisted on doing it alone, their voice slightly sharper than necessary. The simple accident had turned ordinary motions into a stage for hidden tensions, revealing aspects of character that polite conversation had previously concealed. Amid the minor chaos, the hall retained its cozy charm. Pine-scented air mingled with the aroma of tea and cinnamon, the fire crackled softly, and the gentle hum of conversation resumed around the disrupted circle. Yet beneath the familiar warmth, the accidental reveal had elevated the stakes. Miss Marple's mind, always attentive to human behavior, catalogued the subtle signals, the surprise, the fleeting embarrassment, the small attempts to protect secrets. Each movement and glance hinted at private matters that might soon demand public acknowledgement, quietly teasing the unfolding story. In this way, a spilled cup of tea and tangled yarn became more than a mere accident. They became the catalyst for observation, insight, and the gentle unraveling of secrets hidden among the stitches. The spilled tea had been cleared, the yarn untangled, and the letters gathered. Yet an unusual hush had settled over the knitting circle. The soft crackle of the fire and the faint clinking of cups on saucers were the only sounds, emphasizing the peculiar weight of the silence. Villagers sat stiffly in their chairs, fingers resting lightly on knitting needles, yet hands twitched occasionally, betraying small nerves. Miss Marple, her own knitting paused, observed quietly, noting how quickly the gentle rhythm of the hall had been replaced by a subtle tension that seemed to ripple beneath polite facades. Mrs. Withers, who usually filled the room with cheerful chatter, now picked at a loose strand of yarn with exaggerated care. Her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the stack of letters, and her lips pursed slightly, as though restraining a comment she could not yet safely voice. Across the semicircle the newcomer shifted uneasily, one foot tapping softly against the wooden floor. She kept glancing at her neighbours, then down at her partially finished scarf, as if seeking reassurance, or perhaps weighing how much to reveal. Miss Marple's trained eyes caught every nuance, every hesitation, every nearly imperceptible shift in posture. Each subtle gesture added to the mosaic of human behaviour small clues that whispered of underlying stories waiting to emerge. A few villagers exchanged brief, whispered words. Their voices were so low that only those nearest could catch fragments of sentences, hints of past misunderstandings and quiet grievances. One muttered, almost to herself, "I never thought it would come to this," while another replied with a vague, dismissive tone, "Best not speak too loudly." Each murmured phrase, though unobtrusive, added layers to the tension. Miss Marple, listening attentively, noted how some reactions were defensive, others cautious, and still others seemed curious but carefully restrained. The balance between curiosity and discretion created a delicate web, holding the room in a quiet suspense that was almost tangible. Miss Marple's mind, as always, worked beneath the calm exterior. She connected the dots between subtle reactions, the glance toward the letters, the tightened grip on knitting needles, the tiny flush on a cheek that betrayed embarrassment or unease. Even minor gestures, the shifting of a foot, a finger tapping nervously, a faint sigh, told a story. Each was a hint, a signpost pointing toward secrets that might soon be revealed. She understood the weight of silence, how it could amplify curiosity, and how, in these quiet moments, truths often struggled to surface in their own time. The hall remained cozy, lit by the warm firelight and dotted with twinkling fairy lights. The scent of pine and the faint aroma of pastries lingered, blending comfort with tension. This juxtaposition, the soft familiarity of the room against the nearly imperceptible anxiety of its occupants, made the silence more compelling. Listeners could almost feel the room's atmosphere, the gentle anticipation hanging in the air, as if the walls themselves held their breath, waiting to see which secret would emerge first. Miss Marple's serene presence provided a calm anchor, yet it did not dilute the suspense. Instead, it heightened awareness, allowing every nuance to be felt more keenly. Slowly, the knitting circle resumed movement, yet words remained measured, deliberate. Eyes met and quickly averted, small sighs punctuated the pauses, and every hand seemed to carry an unspoken question. The silence itself had become a storyteller, gently urging attention to the subtext of gestures and expressions. Miss Marple's quiet observation transformed the scene into a careful study of human psychology, a delicate dance of anticipation and restraint. In this suspended moment, listeners were drawn fully into the tension, their curiosity piqued, wondering which thread of the hidden past would be tugged first, and how the cozy evening might unravel to reveal truths long held in shadow. Chapter 5. The Village. Carol. The crisp winter evening embraced the village as the knitting circle stepped outside, scarves and mittens wrapped snugly around their faces. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the dark sky, settling gently on shoulders and hair, and the quiet crunch of boots against the frosted ground added a rhythmic charm to the festive night. Miss Marple, keeping pace near the centre of the small group, adjusted her shawl and surveyed her neighbours with careful attention. The Village Carol event, a yearly tradition, provided the perfect backdrop for observation. Cheerful melodies masked subtle tensions, while shared laughter hid undercurrents of unspoken curiosity. As the group joined the larger gathering, voices rose in soft harmonies. The sound of silent night mingled with the occasional squeak of a boot and the faint rustle of long coats. Amid the familiar songs, Miss Marple noted the quiet exchanges between villagers, a whispered word here, a fleeting touch on an arm there. She observed Mrs. Withers leaning toward a neighbour with an almost conspiratorial smile, and the newcomer's eyes darting nervously toward the direction of the town's notice board. Small gestures, innocuous to anyone else, carried weight in the eyes of someone attuned to the subtleties of human interaction. Even amid music, secrets found ways to speak. A misplaced gift drew particular attention. A small package, carefully wrapped in silver paper, had fallen unnoticed behind a bench. When someone bent to retrieve it, a brief, tense exchange occurred, so quiet that only Miss Marple seemed fully aware of it. The recipient's hesitation, the hurried explanations offered, and the subtle shift of glances between bystanders all created tiny ripples of intrigue. Miss Marple catalogued each reaction, noting the slight stiffening of shoulders, the careful avoidance of eye contact, and the delicate interplay of guilt and concern. Even in the midst of festivity, human nature revealed its complexities in gestures no larger than a twitch of a finger. The night air carried faint murmurs of an argument as well, soft words exchanged between two villagers near the lamp-post, barely audible over the choral voices. Miss Marple's ears, trained to hear nuance, picked up the subtle tension, a disagreement about a past event, perhaps, or the misinterpretation of a previous kindness. The manner in which each participant shifted their weight, adjusted a glove, or averted a glance, offered as much information as the words themselves. Every slight movement became a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple's mind quietly began weaving the threads together, creating connections that would not be apparent to anyone less observant. Throughout the carol event, Miss Marple continued to watch, silently noting interactions between individuals, who lingered beside whom, who whispered explanations that seemed too deliberate, who smiled in a way that masked curiosity. All became small clues in her ongoing assessment of the circle. The snowfall, the glow of lamplight, and the harmonious songs provided a comforting, festive ambiance. Yet within that charm, she found the perfect stage for observation. The contrast between the outward celebration and the subtle tensions beneath it heightened her awareness, making even the gentlest gestures meaningful. By the time the final notes of the carol faded into the crisp night, Miss Marple had catalogued a mental map of interactions, gestures, and whispers. Every smile, every subtle glance, and every brief hesitation offered hints of connections, secrets, and minor grievances. Listeners, following her observations, could share in the quiet puzzle of human behavior, piecing together relationships and motives alongside her. The village's festive spirit had not dulled the intrigue, it had only added layers, intertwining cozy charm with subtle, curiosity-driven suspense, ensuring that every participant and every attentive listener remained captivated by the evening's unfolding mysteries. As the final carols drifted into the crisp night air, the villagers began to disperse, laughter and conversation mingling with the soft crunch of boots on snow. Miss Marple lingered near the edge of the group, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes quietly sweeping the gathering for the subtle signs she had learned to notice over many years. Amid the cheerful bustle, a small, almost imperceptible movement caught her attention, a little figure darting between legs and benches, carrying with it the innocence of a child too young to fully grasp the significance of what it observed. It was young Peter, the baker's son, barely 7, with cheeks pink from the cold and eyes wide with curiosity. He held a scrap of paper he had found behind a lamp-post, where the misplaced gift from earlier had fallen. The paper bore marks of hurried writing, lines only partially legible, yet enough to suggest it contained information that, if understood, could illuminate part of the evening's mysterious tensions. Peter, oblivious to the implications, waved the scrap excitedly and murmured questions to himself, half in awe and half in playful confusion. Miss Marple, standing a few steps away, smiled quietly to herself, noting the child's presence as both a delight and a potential key to unfolding events. Nearby, the village cat, a sleek black creature named Shadow, padded silently along the edges of the gathering. It paused, whiskers twitching near the fallen letters in the scrap Peter held. The cat's silent inspection of the scene seemed almost purposeful, and Miss Marple watched with quiet amusement as the feline's movements mirrored the human curiosity surrounding the small piece of paper. Shadow's soft, deliberate steps added another layer of attention to the unnoticed details of the evening, reinforcing the sense that even the smallest observers could witness more than anyone might suspect. Miss Marple did not intervene. She knew the value of allowing events to unfold naturally, of letting tension simmer rather than forcing revelation prematurely. The child's excitement, the cat's patient observation, and the hushed exchanges between villagers all combined to create a delicate suspense. Each element of the scene carried significance, but only careful attention would reveal the connections. Miss Marple's calm presence provided stability, allowing the situation to progress while preserving the cozy, festive atmosphere of the snowy village night. As Peter moved closer to a bench, whispering questions under his breath, the villagers remained unaware of the small drama unfolding in their midst. Miss Marple's mind catalogued each detail, the child's gestures, the slight crinkle of paper, the careful movements of Shadow, and the lingering expressions of adults who had noticed nothing yet. The juxtaposition of innocence and insight created a subtle tension, one that invited attentive listeners to anticipate what might soon emerge. This gentle suspense, framed by holiday cheer and the quiet serenity of the snowfall, allowed the audience to feel part of the scene while preserving the warmth and charm of the village gathering. By the time the group finally began to retreat toward their homes, Miss Marple had already begun considering how the small witness, child and cat alike, might connect to the scattered clues, the letters, and the subtle grievances she had observed throughout the evening. The snow continued to fall softly, muffling footsteps and casting a calm, reflective glow across the village square. Listeners, snug in their own spaces, could sense the tension held in check, the anticipation of revelation hovering gently in the air. In this quiet, cozy scene, the smallest observers, unassuming, innocent, and patient, prepared to play their part in the unraveling story, teasing the secrets that Miss Marple would gently uncover in time. Chapter 6. Knots of Suspicion. The village hall had emptied slightly, leaving only a few lingering members of the knitting circle and the warm glow of the fireplace casting soft shadows across the room. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, her steps soft against the polished wooden floor, her keen eyes scanning faces with gentle curiosity. The cozy winter evening, with snow lightly falling against the frosted windows, belied the careful scrutiny she was about to employ. Each villager, wrapped in scarves and shawls, seemed relaxed at first glance, yet subtle hesitations and fleeting expressions suggested stories not entirely aligned with the cheerful exterior. She began with Mrs. Withers, who had remained near the fire, fingers nervously twisting a strand of yarn. Miss Marple's tone was conversational, soft and warm, as if the discussion were merely idle chatter. "I was wondering, Mrs. Withers, if you might recall the last meeting before Christmas last year?" she asked gently, watching the older woman's reaction. Mrs. Withers hesitated, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. The words she chose were polite, almost rehearsed, yet there was a flicker of inconsistency that Miss Marple noticed immediately, a small detail about an event that didn't quite match what she had heard earlier. The discrepancy was subtle, almost insignificant, yet in the quiet hall it hummed with potential significance. Turning her attention to the newcomer, Miss Marple employed the same gentle approach. The young woman's hands, still warm from the carol gathering, fidgeted with the edge of her shawl as she recounted her previous knitting experiences. Her narrative was cautious, careful not to reveal too much, yet small contradictions emerged when she spoke of last week's circle activities compared to what Miss Marple had observed in her notes. Each contradiction, minor though it appeared, added to the tapestry of information, stitching together the hidden tensions that had been quietly accumulating over the evening. Next, she approached another familiar villager, a matronly figure who had always been precise with her words. The conversation began lightly, with Miss Marple commenting on the weather and the ease of the evening's gathering. Gradually, she guided the dialogue toward the subtle incidents of the night, the spilled tea, the misplaced gift, the letters that had surfaced unexpectedly. Each answer she received seemed calm and collected, yet in the pauses, the slight changes in tone, and the careful choice of words, she detected the faint traces of unease and concealed truth. Observing quietly, she catalogued the gestures, the shifts in posture, the gentle avoidance of certain topics, all while preserving the cozy, unthreatening atmosphere that allowed these revelations to surface naturally. By the time the last of her quiet, individualized inquiries concluded, Miss Marple had amassed a rich mental record of small contradictions, fleeting hesitations and subtle signals of guardedness. The hall's fire continued to flicker, the snow outside creating a serene backdrop for the evening's gentle tension. Listeners, snug in their own chairs or beneath blankets, experienced the pleasure of following an attentive detective through the intricate web of human behavior, enjoying the satisfaction of observing patterns emerge without the discomfort of overt conflict. The cozy winter setting remained, the knitting needles idle for now, as Miss Marple reflected silently on the minor discrepancies and delicate deceptions she had witnessed. Each villager's narrative, seemingly innocuous, had quietly revealed pieces of a larger puzzle, and in that warmth, beneath the glow of the hall and the falling snow, the threads of suspicion were drawn taut, ready to unravel when the moment arrived. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm, flickering glow across the faces of the knitting circle, now gathered more closely in a semicircle near the hearth. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting in hand, observed the subtle shifts in posture and expression as the evening deepened. Each villager carried the weight of their own history, and tonight those histories were beginning to reveal themselves, weaving a complex tapestry of past grievances, present ambitions, and private fears. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the rising tension, creating an atmosphere both cozy and charged with anticipation. Mrs. Withers, ever attentive to social standing, had begun a tentative conversation with the newcomer, her voice polite but measured. Beneath the polite exchanges, Miss Marple noticed the faint edge of rivalry in her tone, an unspoken reminder of a minor dispute from last winter about the placement of a decorative centerpiece. The newcomer, eager to fit in yet cautious of missteps, responded carefully, her words smooth and conciliatory, though a fleeting glance betrayed her underlying apprehension. Miss Marple noted the delicate push and pull between them, recognizing the potential for minor resentments to swell into larger conflicts if left unacknowledged. Across the room, another member fidgeted with her knitting, her hands twisting a single strand of yarn repeatedly. She spoke softly to a neighbor about an upcoming charity project, but Miss Marple, with her habitual attentiveness, caught the faint defensiveness behind her words. The conversation revealed more than it appeared on the surface: old tensions over responsibilities in previous events, unspoken frustrations at being overlooked, and the subtle desire to assert competence. Each remark, gentle though it sounded, hinted at motives shaped by pride, fear, and the desire to maintain appearances. Even the quietest participants carried stories that contributed to the tangled web of intentions. A middle-aged woman mentioned a long-forgotten argument over a misdelivered package, laughing it off with a tone that suggested the memory still stung more than she admitted. Another villager, whose outward demeanour was calm and composed, revealed in a hushed aside a lingering concern over a past breach of trust within the circle. Miss Marple catalogued these revelations silently, connecting dots between minor disputes and recurring patterns of anxiety and suspicion. The warmth of the fire, but the gentle hum of conversation and the softly twinkling lights provided a comforting frame for what might otherwise have been an uncomfortable evening of confessions and admissions. Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, noting how individual grievances intertwined with broader social dynamics. Some motives were obvious: the desire for recognition, the subtle wish to influence decisions, or the instinct to protect one's reputation. Others were more layered, involving long-standing insecurities, unspoken expectations, and the fear of being misunderstood. The interactions, often polite and understated, nonetheless revealed the fragile bonds holding the circle together. Each whispered comment, each carefully measured word, added nuance to the emerging picture, a pattern of human behavior that balanced affection, loyalty, and the quiet potential for discord. By the time the evening progressed, Miss Marple had formed a mental map of the relationships and hidden motives within the group. She understood who might feel slighted, who sought approval, and who was quietly wary of another's influence. The knitting circle's bonds, though outwardly strong, were subtly tested, revealing tensions that could, if circumstances aligned, lead to revelations far more significant than a spilled cup of tea or a misplaced gift. Listeners, gently guided through these observations, could begin piecing together the intricate puzzle, sensing the interplay of motives and personalities while remaining immersed in the cozy, winter-lit charm of the village hall. As the firelight danced across the room, Miss Marple's quiet smile suggested satisfaction at the clarity forming in her mind. The strands of gossip, grievances, and personal fears were slowly coalescing into a coherent picture. The scandal that had been hinted at for weeks was beginning to take shape, framed by the warmth, charm, and subtle intrigue of the evening. The gentle tension, woven into the heart of this cozy scene, ensured that attentive listeners were both comforted and captivated, waiting for the threads to unravel fully in the unfolding story. Up to 7, the scandal emerges. The village hall had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on, leaving only the soft hum of conversation, the occasional clink of china, and the warm glow of the fire dancing across the walls. Miss Marple, seated near the centre of the circle with her teacup poised delicately in hand, observed the subtle rhythms of the gathering. The time had come, she thought, to allow the thread she had quietly gathered over the past evenings to surface, gently guiding the group toward the truths that had long lingered in shadow. Tea was poured in careful silence, the steam rising in graceful curls that mingled with the scent of pine and cinnamon from the nearby decorations. Miss Marple took a measured sip, then began to ask small, pointed questions, framed innocuously within casual conversation. "I believe someone mentioned a mix-up with last year's charity gift," she said softly, glancing around the circle. The question seemed harmless, yet it prompted a series of quick glances and slight hesitations. Listeners could almost feel the subtle tightening of breaths, the small flutter of nerves, as the first hints of the scandal began to emerge into the warm, festive air. Mrs. Withers, usually so confident in her social standing, flushed slightly, admitting that she had mistakenly taken credit for a contribution that had, in fact, been orchestrated by another member. Her confession was spoken with polite humility, but the relief in her eyes was evident, as though a small burden had been lifted. Miss Marple nodded quietly, encouraging a gentle acknowledgement without any sense of judgment. The group, listening, felt the warmth of resolution beginning to blend with the intrigue, the cozy charm of the hall softening the edges of tension that had been quietly building. Nearby, the newcomer admitted to a minor misunderstanding concerning a misdelivered gift, explaining that it had been misplaced and later found, a simple human error that had nonetheless fueled whispers and uncertainty. The disclosure, shared with a light laugh, drew smiles from several other members, and the atmosphere, while still charged with curiosity, softened into one of gentle camaraderie. Miss Marple's skill lay not only in uncovering truths, but in creating a space where they could be shared comfortably, where honesty was met with understanding rather than criticism. As each revelation surfaced, listeners could sense the threads of the scandal beginning to intertwine and resolve. A whispered argument about an heirloom, a small miscommunication about holiday preparations, and subtle misunderstandings that had persisted over months now came into view, forming a cohesive picture of human foibles rather than malice. The scandal, carefully teased and hinted at throughout the evening, was revealed in a manner that felt natural, almost inevitable, yet satisfying in its clarity. Shock, relief, and gentle regret passed across faces, tempered by the warmth of friendship and shared experience. By the end of tea, the knitting circle had experienced both tension and release. Miss Marple, knitting needles resting lightly in her lap, allowed a few moments of silence for reflection. The cozy winter setting, the crackling fire, the twinkling lights, and the faint scent of pastries provided a comforting frame for these delicate revelations. Listeners, attuned to the subtle interplay of dialogue and gesture, could feel the gentle unfolding of truth, the quiet satisfaction of mysteries resolved, and the enduring warmth of village connections. Even amid acknowledged mistakes and minor grievances, the hall settled into a quieter rhythm after the teas and revelations. The fire crackled softly, and the scent of pine and freshly baked treats lingered in the air, lending a comforting backdrop to the delicate work of reconciliation. Miss Marple, knitting needles resting lightly on her lap, allowed the moment to breathe. She observed the villagers as they quietly processed the events, their faces softening from the tension of earlier disclosures to expressions of reflection and, in some cases, relief. Mrs. Withers, still seated near the hearth, took a deep breath and offered a gentle apology to those she had unintentionally slighted over the previous misunderstandings. Her voice was calm, warm, and sincere, and the group responded with nods, smiles, and murmured reassurances. The simple act of acknowledging mistakes seemed to lift a weight from the circle, and the atmosphere shifted subtly from anticipation to shared understanding. Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the fleeting glances of others, noting how relief and acceptance moved quietly through the group like a soft ripple across still water. The newcomer, encouraged by the forgiving tone, shared her own reflections. She admitted her nervousness in joining the group and her fear of making errors, which had compounded the minor confusions that had arisen during the gathering. The acknowledgement was met with gentle laughter and warm remarks, emphasizing the supportive nature of the knitting circle. Miss Marple noted how the act of sharing fostered a sense of trust, reinforcing bonds rather than unraveling them. The listeners, snug and attentive, could sense the shift, feeling the warmth of human connection and understanding as naturally as they felt the flicker of the fire. Others joined in, recounting small misunderstandings or oversights with honesty, each confession a thread leading back to harmony. A minor quarrel about the placement of ornaments the previous week was resolved with light-hearted amusement, and a discussion about the missing gift concluded with shared smiles and quiet acknowledgement that mistakes are part of life. Through these gentle acts of recognition and apology, the village hall seemed to exhale, the collective tension softening into comfort. Miss Marple, ever observant, recognized how the acknowledgement of imperfections often strengthens rather than diminishes relationships. By the end of the evening, the circle had transformed. The warmth of the fire reflected the warmth among the villagers, and the twinkling lights above seemed to echo the lightness settling into hearts. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and thoughtful, followed each subtle gesture, hands clasped in reassurance, nods of agreement, and smiles shared without hesitation. The once tense gathering now radiated companionship, empathy, and the gentle satisfaction of conflict resolved. Listeners felt the same restorative sense, the quiet magic of human understanding framed within a cozy winter setting. where mistakes were forgiven and connections reaffirmed. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The knitting circle, once tangled with misunderstandings, had found its rhythm once more. Harmony had returned not through grand gestures, but through small acts of honesty, reflection, and quiet apology. As the villagers prepared to leave for the snowy night outside, the room hummed with gentle warmth, and the soft glow of lamps and firelight seemed to echo the enduring human truth that kindness, patience, and forgiveness can weave bonds stronger than any tension or misstep. Chapter 8. Christmas Morning Calm. Morning arrived softly over the village, the pale winter sun glinting off the fresh layer of snow that blanketed rooftops and hedges alike. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, carrying the familiar scent of burning logs and warm kitchens into the crisp air. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional crunch of boots against frost-laden paths, as villagers began their day in a gentle rhythm, unhurried and content. From her cosy cottage, Miss Marple watched the world awaken with a sense of calm satisfaction, sipping tea and allowing the serene beauty of the morning to settle around her like a comforting shawl. Inside, the fire glowed softly, the amber light reflecting off polished wood and neatly arranged holiday decorations. Miss Marple's knitting rested on her lap, needles moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm as she reflected on the events of the past week. The spilled tea, tangled yarn, and whispered confessions now felt distant, softened by time and understanding. Each stitch seemed to mirror the steady restoration of harmony in the village, a tactile reminder that even small disturbances could be resolved with patience, observation, and gentle care. Listeners could almost feel the warmth of her hands moving the yarn, the quiet satisfaction in her measured, thoughtful pace. Outside the windows, children peered eagerly at the freshly fallen snow, their excitement tempered by the gentle hush of morning. Doors opened to welcome neighbors, greetings exchanged with smiles and laughter. The village, once quiet with uncertainty, now hummed with the gentle joy of familiarity and connection. Miss Marple noticed small gestures of reconciliation, a nod here, a brief conversation there, quiet confirmations that yesterday's tensions had melted into goodwill. Even Mrs. Withers, whose curiosity and occasional sharpness had sparked minor disputes, moved among friends with a relaxed grace, offering cheerful words that carried the lightness of forgiveness and shared warmth. In the kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked bread and spiced cakes intertwined with the lingering scent of pine from the carefully arranged tree. Miss Marple allowed herself to savor a slow sip of tea, the delicate warmth mingling with the ambient comfort of her surrounding. The letters and minor misunderstandings that had once caused unease now rested in neat stacks tucked away and rendered harmless by honesty and reflection. Every detail of the village, from the snow-tipped hedgerows to the softly chiming church bells, contributed to a sense of restorative calm, a reassurance to listeners that balance had returned, and that the web of social intricacies had been carefully untangled. Neighbors visited briefly, exchanging gifts and warm smiles, each interaction reinforcing the bonds renewed over the past days. Miss Marple observed quietly, nodding occasionally, appreciating the subtle beauty of a community restored. The knitting circle, though paused for the holiday morning, lingered in memory as a testament to the power of patience, attentive listening, and gentle guidance. Each character, once weighed down by unspoken grievances or minor rivalries, now moved with ease and familiarity, a reflection of the quiet triumph of understanding over tension. As the morning stretched lazily, Miss Marple sat back, allowing the soft sounds of the village, the distant laughter of children, the hum of conversation, and the faint rustle of paper from holiday letters to surround her. The sense of festive harmony, woven through snow, firelight, and quiet reflections, reassured both characters and listeners alike. It was a morning of resolution, comfort, and peace, a gentle conclusion to a week of intrigue where every secret had found its place and every bond had been quietly restored. In this cosy, serene tableau, the village, its people, and the attentive mind of Miss Marple were at ease, inviting listeners to rest alongside them in the calm, snowy embrace of Christmas morning. As the morning light deepened and the snow outside sparkled like tiny diamonds, Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair by the window, knitting in hand but momentarily still. The warmth of the fire licked softly at her ankles, and the quiet hum of the village life outside offered a gentle accompaniment to her thoughts. Today the house was peaceful, the knitting circle's small dramas resolved, and the once tense air of holiday preparations now carried only soft laughter and a sense of calm satisfaction. It was the perfect moment for reflection, a time to consider the quiet lessons tucked into human behavior and the small, intricate stories that shaped the lives of the people around her. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the snow-dusted garden, where the footprints of neighbours and children marked the night's activities. She thought of Mrs. Withers, whose enthusiasm had once sparked minor disputes, now softened by honesty and reconciliation. She remembered the newcomer who had hesitated so nervously at the beginning of the week, yet had found her place among friends by the gentle guidance of patience and observation. Each small interaction, each subtle revelation, had contributed to the delicate tapestry of understanding that made the village both familiar and complex. And Miss Marple, ever attentive to human nature, saw that the capacity for error and the ability to forgive were intertwined, forming the quiet backbone of communal life. The letters, the whispers, and the minor missteps of recent days seemed almost like echoes now, faint reminders of how easily misunderstandings could arise and how carefully they could be untangled with thoughtfulness and care. Miss Marple mused on the nature of secrets, both hidden and confessed. Some, she reflected, were like threads in a sweater. When tangled, they could cause discomfort, yet when carefully woven or gently unravelled, they added warmth and texture to the fabric of human relationships. Forgiveness, patience, and a willingness to observe without judgment were the tools that transformed potential discord into harmony. Her mind lingered on the villagers she had quietly watched, noting small gestures of kindness, fleeting glances of reassurance, and words spoken with consideration. Even the smallest act, helping a neighbour untangle yarn, offering a comforting smile, or simply listening attentively, carried significance. In these gentle exchanges, Miss Marple saw the essence of community, a blend of empathy, understanding, and the shared human desire for connection. Listeners, following her reflections, could feel the warmth of a village knit together not only by proximity but by care and shared experience, a comforting notion to carry into their own lives. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented sigh. She reflected on the subtle beauty of imperfection, on how misunderstandings could teach patience, and how even small communities contained stories of hope, reconciliation, and quiet triumph. She invited herself, and, through the narrative, the listeners, to consider the small secrets in their own circles, the tiny misunderstandings and unspoken gestures that shaped relationships. Each person, she thought, had the power to transform minor tension into gentle understanding, and each bond, when nurtured, could endure beyond fleeting troubles. The fire flickered, the snow glistened, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting with a sense of calm completeness. The village was at peace, the scandals resolved, and the heart of human kindness had quietly prevailed. And in this cosy, reflective moment, listeners could rest alongside her, contemplating the small mysteries of their own lives, the warmth of connection, and the enduring grace of patience, observation, and forgiveness. It was a final thought for the season, a gentle reminder that even in a world of subtle intrigues, harmony and understanding were always within reach.